My dad left me alone to vacation with my stepfamily, but now he wants me to support my stepsister. Let me tell you about how everything went downhill after my mom passed away. I was only 9 years old, and it felt like everything in my life just stopped making sense. My mom was my whole world. She made everything feel normal and safe, but when she passed, that safety kind of disappeared, and everything changed. First, I thought maybe my dad, Mike, would hold things together. He's 47 now, but back then he was in his mid-30s. I assumed that since he was my dad, he'd step up. Spoiler alert, he didn't. For a little while, things were fine. It was just me and him. We tried to find some kind of routine without Mom. He'd take me to school. We'd have dinner together. It wasn't perfect, but it wasn't terrible either. Then, about a year later, he started dating this woman, Jane. I didn't know much about her at first. She was 35, 12 years younger than my dad. She seemed nice enough. Looking back, I should have seen the warning signs from day one. Jane didn't waste any time moving in after they got serious. It was perfect, but it wasn't terrible either. Then, about a year later, he started dating this woman, Jane. I didn't know much about her at first except that she was younger than my dad. Like 12 years younger, so she was 35. I remember the first time she came over to our house for dinner. She seemed nice enough, but looking back, I should have seen the warning signs from day one. Jane didn't waste any time moving in after they got serious. It wasn't long before she brought along her daughter Betty, who was 17 at the time. Betty was the definition of spoiled from the minute they walked through the door. It was like they owned the place. Jane didn't even try to make me feel included. She just took over like she'd been running the show forever. My dad, for some reason, just went along with it. I was just a kid, 9 years old, and I was still grieving the loss of my mom. I was only 9 years old, and I was already dealing with the loss of my mom. I didn't know how to handle it, but I quickly noticed that my dad started changing. He wasn't my dad anymore. It was like Jane became the priority, and I was pushed aside. I don't even know how to describe it. I was there, but I wasn't important. Things got worse when it became clear that I wasn't treated like a kid in my own home. You'd think that after losing, I was the maid in my own home. My mom, my dad, and Jane showed no sympathy or understanding. They treated me like I was invisible. Jane gave Betty all the attention while I did all the chores. I was not allowed to speak up. I was cleaning up after Betty constantly. She was 17, but she acted like a toddler. Betty acted like a toddler, leaving her mess everywhere. It was always up to me to clean it up. Betty would be out with her friends or sitting around watching TV while I was stuck washing dishes, vacuuming, or doing whatever chore Jane threw my way. My dad didn't do a damn thing to help. He acted like it was normal for his 9-year-old daughter to be treated like a housekeeper. I couldn't understand why he was okay with it, but at the same time I didn't know how to speak up either. But you know what really did it for me? That Christmas trip. They all decided to go on a vacation together. My dad, Jane, and Betty. They were going somewhere nice. I think it was a cabin up in the mountains. I was excited at first because I thought I was going too. It's Christmas, right? Family time. But nope. I was told that I had to stay home and look after Betty's dog Max. They made me stay behind with a dog while they went off on this fancy vacation. Let me be clear. I love dogs, but Max was not my dog. He was Betty's dog. I tried to suggest that we take Max to a boarding place or hire a pet sitter, but Jane shut me down. She said it was a waste of money and that I was perfectly capable of staying home alone to take care of him. I was only 9 years old. I was capable of staying home alone for 3 days. I was 9 years old, and they left me there by myself to take care of the house and the dog while they went off and had a great time. I remember sitting in the living room that first night feeling completely abandoned. I was scared, sad, and angry all at the same time. It was Christmas, for crying out loud, and instead of being with my family, I was stuck at home watching some hyperdog. It was as if my dad didn't care about me anymore. I felt like I wasn't part of his new family. What hurt the most was that my dad was okay with all of this. He didn't fight for me. He didn't make an effort to include me. He just went along with whatever Jane wanted. And what she wanted was for me to stay out of the picture. That Christmas marked a huge turning point for me. From that moment on, I started feeling more and more distant. From my dad, I saw a different side of him I never expected. He let Jane call the shots, and I was always the one getting the short end of the stick. Every holiday, every family event, it was always about Jane and Betty. I was just there in the background, expected to do what they wanted. Looking back, I wish I had spoken up more. But at the time, what was I supposed to do? I didn't have the words or the courage to stand up to them. My dad or Jane, I just took it. That's probably why things kept getting worse over the years. But here's the thing. I wasn't completely alone after that awful Christmas. My Aunt Sarah, who was my mom's sister, came over with my cousin Danny. They had heard what happened and made it their mission to make me feel better. They brought over Christmas presents, cooked a big dinner, and made it feel like a real holiday, even though it was after the fact. Danny even stayed over. Aunt Sarah and Danny became my rock after that. They didn't need to step up, but they did, and I'll never forget it. If it wasn't for them, I don't know how I would have gotten through it all. Those years of being treated like I didn't matter. That Christmas showed me who my real family was, and it sure wasn't my dad or Jane. So, I'm going to tell you about how things played out after that whole Christmas mess. Like I said, after that holiday, I started pulling away from my dad. How could I not? Felt like he'd picked his side and it wasn't mine. But there's more to this story. And the stuff that happened after it was clear that I was never going to be treated like part of the family. Things with Jane didn't improve. They got worse. She started acting like the queen of the house, which meant I had more responsibilities. By the time I was 12, I was doing everything around the house. Laundry, dishes, vacuuming, you name it. And every time I asked for some help, Jane just smiled and said, "No." It was good practice for when you have your own home one day. At 12, I didn't even know how to cook for myself, but she expected me to keep the entire house spotless. Betty, on the other hand, was still the golden child. She was 17 when Jane and my dad got married, and let me tell you, she knew how to play her mom like a fiddle. Anytime Jane was about to ask her to do something around the house, Betty would she'd come up with some excuse, homework, hanging out with friends, or some kind of important thing she had going on. And every time, Jane would just let it slide. Meanwhile, I'd be scrubbing the floors or cleaning up after their little family dinners. It was like they expected me to disappear into the background and just be their unpaid maid. But what really pissed me off was the way my dad just sat there and let it all happen. He'd be sitting in his chair watching TV while Jane barked orders at me like I was some kind of servant. He didn't say a word. Not once did he step in and say, "Hey, maybe you should help out too, Betty or even Jane." I don't know if he was too scared to stand up to her or if he just didn't care. Either way, it hurt. One time, when I was about 14, I actually tried to talk to him about it. I told him I didn't think it was right. I was the only one doing all the work while Betty did nothing. He said, "Life's not always fair. You just have to deal with it." That was it. No empathy. No understanding. Just deal with it. After that conversation, I kind of gave up on expecting anything different from him. Now, here's where Aunt Sarah and Danny come back into the picture. After that Christmas, they didn't just disappear from my life. They stuck around. Aunt Sarah would come over for birth. Danny was always there for me, even though she was a few years older than me. We got super close. She was like the big sister I never had. We'd hang out at Aunt Sarah's place whenever I needed a break from Jane's constant nagging or Betty's messes. Danny would take me out for ice cream, and we'd go shopping or sometimes just sit around and binge-watch TV shows. Danny was the first person I felt like I could talk to about everything going on at home. She knew how crappy things were for me and never made me feel like I was being too dramatic. One weekend when I was about 16, I was staying over at Aunt Sarah's, and Danny and I were talking about how things were at home. I told her about how Jane had yelled at me for not folding the laundry fast enough that week. It was something so dumb, but it had really gotten to me. Danny just looked at me and said, "You know this isn't normal. You're not supposed to be treated like this." It hit me harder than I expected. I'd spent so many years thinking this was just how life was supposed to be that I hadn't even realized how messed up it all was. Danny and Aunt Sarah were always so kind to me, but it wasn't until that moment that I realized how different my life could be if after that conversation, I knew I had to make a change. I stopped caring about pleasing Jane or trying to get my dad to see my side. I started focusing on school, hanging out with Danny, and doing things for myself. I still did the chores because I had to, but I didn't let it get to me. I kept my head down and told myself that one day I'd be out of there. And I was right. When I turned 18, I got accepted to college with a full scholarship, my ticket out. I wasn't going to waste it. The day I left for school, Jane didn't even bother to say goodbye. She just gave me a half-hearted good luck and went back to whatever she was doing. Betty didn't care either, but my dad seemed sad. He hugged me for what felt like the first time in years and told me he was proud of me. It was strange hearing that from him after everything, but at that point it didn't matter. I was focused on leaving that house. College was a whole new world. I got to start over, make new friends, and live my life without feeling like a burden or a maid. Aunt Sarah and Danny were still my biggest supporters, sending me care packages and visiting whenever they could. They were the only family I really cared about at that point. But of course, even though I was gone, Jane and Betty weren't done stirring up drama. About halfway through my first semester, I got a call from my dad. He told me that Jane and Betty had been talking, and they thought it would be a good idea if I came home for the holidays. He made it sound like this big olive branch, like they were finally ready to treat me like part of the family. I wasn't buying it. I could hear Jane in the background telling my dad what to do. I was done with trying to make things work with my dad and Jane. They had their chance, and they blew it. I told him I was spending the holidays with Sarah and Danny, and that was that. He didn't argue. He just sighed and said, "Okay, maybe next time." There wouldn't be a next time. I blew it. I had my real family now. Aunt Sarah, Danny, and the life I was building for myself. So after all that, I guess the takeaway is this. Sometimes the people you're born into a family with aren't the ones who end up being your real family. Sometimes it's the people who step up when no one else will. That's exactly what Aunt Sarah and Danny did for me. So now that I've told you how I got through all that mess with Jane and my dad, let's talk about what happened after I moved out for college. You'd think that after finally getting away from them, things would calm down. Well, not exactly. In fact, it feels like that's when the real drama kicked off. And of course it all came back to one person. Betty. So I'm a couple years into college at this point, living my best life. I've got good friends, I'm doing well in my class, and for the first time I'm really starting to have control over my own life. Aunt Sarah and Danny are still super supportive, and I'm visiting them whenever I can. However, I was basically keeping my distance from the whole family situation with my dad and Jane. I figured if I just focused on school and away things would stay peaceful, but Betty had other plans. One day, I got this random message from her. Let me just say that me and Betty never really talked. She was always doing her own thing. I was just the maid in her eyes. So when I saw her name pop up on my phone, I was like, what now? She started acting all friendly, like we've been best buds this whole time. She asked me how college was and what I was studying. I sat there waiting for her to get to the point. Then, she told me she wanted to talk about something important. Betty saw me as a maid, so when she sent me a message, I was ready for it. She started off acting friendly, like we've been best buds this whole time. She asked about college and what I'm studying. I'm sitting there thinking, okay, what's her angle? Betty wasn't messaging me out of the goodness of her heart. She got straight to the point. Turns out, Betty was having trouble with her college classes. She failed a couple of classes and was struggling to stay in school. Of course, Betty wasn't taking responsibility for it. She blamed her professors, the assignments, and everything but herself. Then she told me the real reason she was messaging me. She asked me to help her with her classes and write a couple of essays for her. She knew I was smart and it would mean a lot to her. Yes, you read that right. Betty wanted me to do her homework after all those years of treating me like crap, ignoring me, and acting like I didn't exist. She suddenly needed my help. I couldn't believe she had the nerve to ask. So I sat there for a minute thinking about how I should respond. Part of me wanted to blow up on her and let all those years of frustration come out. But I knew that wasn't worth it. Betty wasn't worth it. I didn't waste any more of my time on her. I simply replied, "Sorry, Betty. I've got my own work to focus on. Good luck with your classes." That was it. I didn't owe her any explanation, and I wasn't about to get sucked into her drama. Of course, she didn't take that well. She tried to guilt-trip me, saying things like, "I thought we were family. You're supposed to help your sister out when she's struggling." Since when did she consider me her sister? Her sister, I wasn't going to let her manipulate me. I ignored the rest of her messages. Here's where it gets interesting. After I turned Betty down, I heard from Jane. She called, and I could tell she was angry. She started going off about how I was selfish for not helping Betty and how I was throwing away an opportunity to bond with my stepsister. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. After everything, they still expected me to go out of my way for them. I told Jane straight up that I wasn't going to do Betty's work for her. If Betty was struggling, maybe she needed to take responsibility for once. Jane didn't like that answer. She started ranting about how I owed it to the family to help out and how I should be grateful for everything they'd done for me. She went on and on about how I should be grateful for everything, for treating me like a servant for most of my childhood, for leaving me behind every time. They went on vacation. I wasn't having it. I ended the conversation and told Jane I wasn't changing my mind. I hung up before she could keep going. I felt good about it. I was setting a boundary with them and I wasn't backing down. Of course, that wasn't the end of it. A few days later, my dad called. I hadn't heard much from him since I'd moved out. I was surprised he was reaching out. He started with small talk, asking about school. I knew what was coming. After a few minutes, he brought up Betty. He tried to play peacemaker, saying Jane was upset and I should reconsider helping Betty. He even threw in the family sticks together line, hoping it would change my mind. I couldn't help but laugh when he said that. Where was all this family talk when I was the one being left behind? Where was this togetherness when I was the one cleaning up after everyone? I told him straight up that I wasn't going to be guilted into doing something that wasn't my responsibility. If Betty couldn't handle her own schoolwork, that was on her, not me. Dad didn't argue much after that. He just sighed and said, "I'm disappointed, but I understand." And that was the end of it. After that conversation, I hung up feeling a weird mix of emotions. I was proud of myself for standing my ground, but also kind of sad that this was what my relationship with my dad had come to. Deep down, I still wanted to have a real connection with him, but every time we talked, it felt like there was this huge wall between us. Anyway, after all that, I didn't hear from Betty or Jane for a while, which was honestly a relief. I focused on my classes, hung out with my friends, and just tried to move on with my life. I wasn't going to let their drama drag me down. A few weeks later, I got a call from Aunt Sarah. She'd heard about the situation with Betty and Jane, and she just wanted to check in on me. We ended up talking for hours. She reminded me that I didn't owe anyone anything. "You've got your own life to live," she said. "Don't let them make you feel guilty for doing what's best for you." She was right, and hearing it from her made me feel even more confident in my decision. I wasn't going to let my dad, Jane, or Betty make me feel bad for putting myself first. I had spent too many years being pushed around and overlooked, and now that I was finally starting to build something for myself, I wasn't about to give that up. That's the story of how Betty tried to drag me back into the chaos, and how I said no for the first time. And honestly, it felt pretty damn good. So here's where things really took a turn. I was doing my thing, focused on school, staying away from all the drama back home with Jane and Betty. For a while, it seemed like they finally got the message to leave me alone. Of course, peace didn't last long. One day, out of nowhere, I got this email from my dad. It wasn't anything long or dramatic. It was just a quick note saying he and Jane wanted to talk. I knew something was up. I hadn't heard from them in months, so if they suddenly wanted to have a talk, it wasn't going to be good. Still, I figured I'd hear them out because despite everything, a small part of me still wanted to believe that maybe they'd changed. Spoiler alert, they hadn't, so I agreed to meet up with them. We decided on this little coffee shop in my hometown, a neutral place where I could make a quick exit if things got bad. I strode in and there they were, sitting at a table like nothing had ever happened. My dad looked tired, like he was older than I remembered, and Jane, well, she looked the same. Cold and detached, like she had somewhere better to be after some awkward small talk. Finally, they got to the point. Jane, of course, was the one who spoke first. She always liked to control the conversation. "We've been talking about the future," she said in that fake sweet voice she used when she was trying to sound reasonable. It's time for you to start thinking about your responsibilities. I was confused. What did she mean by that? Father and I are getting older and Betty is going to need some help getting settled in life. You know, the same Betty who never lifted a finger to help me, who treated me like trash, who I hadn't spoken to in months because she only ever reached out when she needed something. Wait, you want me to help Betty? I asked, trying to keep my cool but already feeling the anger bubbling up. My dad finally spoke up, his voice tired and resigned. She's struggling, and we just thought that as her sister, you'd want to help out. You're doing well for yourself. I was shocked. They thought I should support Betty financially? The same Betty who never reached out to me unless she needed homework help? I felt like I was in an alternate reality. Everyone had lost their minds. I leaned back in my chair, trying to process what they were asking. Let me get this straight, I said, looking directly at Jane because I knew you want me to take money I've earned from my own hard work and just hand it over to Betty? Why? Because she can't get her life together? Jane didn't even hesitate. That's what family does. We help each other. Since you're doing well, we thought it would be fair for you to help your sister. In that moment, something in me snapped. All those years of being treated like I was just there to serve them. It didn't matter. They were asking for the impossible. I'm not responsible for Betty's life. She's a grown woman. If she can't figure things out, that's on her, not me. My dad tried to jump in, but I wasn't done. Do you even hear yourselves? After everything, you still expect me to just drop everything and fix Betty's problems. You never helped me when I needed it. You let me clean up after her. Let me be the one who was always left behind. Now that I finally have my own life, you want to drag me back into this mess. No. Jane's face hardened, and I knew what was coming next. She always had a way of flipping things to make me feel guilty. You're being selfish, she said, her voice cold. We've done so much. You think you've done so much for me? You've turned your back on your family. Couldn't help but laugh at that. You think you've done so much for me, leaving me behind on holidays, making me do all the work around the house while Betty got a free pass, never once treating me like I mattered? That's what you consider helping me? My dad looked down at his hands, not saying anything. Jane, though, wasn't backing down. We gave you a home, we raised you. This is how you repay us? You think this is the thanks we get? You're going to regret this one day when you realize how much we did for you. I was done. I stood up, grabbed my stuff, and looked them both in the eye. I don't owe you anything. I said it firmly. I've built my life on my own without your help. If Betty needs support, then maybe it's time you step up and help her yourselves. But I'm not going to be a part of this. I walked out before they could say anything else. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt angry but also relieved. I had finally said everything I'd been holding in for years, and it felt good. I wasn't going to let them drag me back into their toxic cycle. I was done being the one who was always expected to sacrifice for everyone else. After that, I didn't hear from them for a while, no calls, no messages, nothing. And honestly, that was fine with me. I was fine with that. I focused on my school, my friends, and the life I was building for myself. I knew that no matter what, I had Aunt Sarah and Danny. They were my real family. They were the ones who had actually been there for me, not just when it was convenient, but when it mattered. The lesson in all this is that family isn't about blood. It's about who shows up, who has your back, and who treats you with respect. Jane and my dad never did any of that. I did not. I walked away from them, and I do not regret it. After all that mess with Jane and my dad, you'd think I'd finally get a break. I pretty much shut down their whole plan to get me to support Betty. I walked out of that coffee shop thinking I was done with them for good. But nope. Life wasn't about to let me off that easy. A few months after that whole confrontation, I was finally finishing up my last year of college. I had a decent job lined up after graduation, and things were going well. Aunt Sarah and Danny were still my rocks, and I was feeling good about where my life was headed. I had cut off all contact with Jane and Betty, and the distance from all that drama was the best thing I could have done for myself. But just like clockwork, right when I thought everything was settling down, my dad decided to show up again. I was in the middle of studying for finals, and I didn't have time for his drama. I was studying for finals when I got a text from him. I hadn't heard from him since that awkward coffee shop meeting. So when I saw his name pop up, my first thought was, what now? The text wasn't long. He just asked if we could talk. There were no details, no explanation. He said, "Hey, we need to talk." I debated ignoring it, but I had a feeling he wanted to apologize. So, like an idiot, I texted him back and agreed to meet. We met at the same coffee shop as last time. I walked in half expecting to see Jane sitting there with him, but she wasn't. It was just him sitting alone, looking more worn down than I'd ever seen him. He had this look on his face that told me whatever he was about to say, it wasn't going to be good. We went through the usual awkward small talk, but I could tell he was nervous. Finally, after a few minutes, he just came out with it. "Betty's in trouble," he said, his voice low. "I don't know what to do." I felt my stomach drop. Here we go again. What kind of trouble? I asked, already bracing myself for the ridiculousness that was sure to follow. "She dropped out of school," he admitted, looking down at his coffee cup. "She couldn't keep up with her classes, and she's been making some bad decisions." When he said bad decisions, I knew exactly what he meant. Betty has always been the type to make dumb choices and then expect someone else to clean up the mess. I had a feeling that this time they were hoping that someone would be me. She's staying with us right now. Jane and I can't keep bailing her out. She's racked up a lot of debt. We're not sure how much longer we can keep helping her. I just stared at him, waiting for the punchline. I could already see where this conversation was headed, but I wasn't going to make it easy for him. I said slowly, "What does that have to do with me?" He looked up at me, and for the first time in a long time, I saw actual desperation in his eyes. They were hoping I could help her out. I've got that new job lined up, and I'm in a better position to give her a hand. That was the moment I had been waiting for. I've been dreading this since the second I saw his name pop up on my phone. They want me to bail Betty out again. I took a deep breath and tried to keep my cool. "Dad, I don't know how many times I have to say this, but I'm not responsible for Betty. She's made her choices, and if those choices have put her in a bad situation, that's on her. I've worked my ass off to get where I am, and I'm not about to throw that away to clean up her mess." He didn't say anything at first. He just sat there staring into his coffee like he was trying to find the right words. Finally, he sighed and said, "I understand. I really do. But she's your sister." That was it. That was the breaking point for me. Couldn't hold back anymore. "She's not my sister," I snapped. "From the minute Jane walked into our lives, you and she, I made it clear that Betty was the priority. I was never part of the family. I was the one cleaning up after her. I was the one left behind while you all went on vacations. Now you expect me to save her? Absolutely not." He looked shocked. He hadn't expected me to actually call him out like that. I wasn't done. "You and Jane made your choices too. You chose to put Betty first to make her your priority. I accepted that a long time ago. But now you're going to have to live with those choices. I'm not going to be your backup plan. If you want to help her, go ahead, but don't expect me to do it." The silence between us was heavy. I could see the hurt in his eyes, but I didn't feel bad about what I said. I was standing up for myself, and it felt damn good. Eventually, he nodded like he finally understood where I was coming from. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I didn't realize how much we hurt you." I didn't say anything. What was there to say? An apology wasn't going to change anything. At this point, I wasn't interested in fixing what was broken. I just wanted to move on with my life. We finished our coffees in silence. When we left the shop, I knew that was probably the last time I'd ever really talked to him. It wasn't a clean break, but it was a break. I wasn't angry. I'm done with the guilt trips, the manipulation, and the constant expectation that I was supposed to fix everything. After I graduated, started my new job, and kept moving forward, I realized that I have Aunts Sarah and Danny, and they're all the family I need. Betty is her own person, and I don't know what happened with her. I don't care. She's made her choices, and now she has to deal with the consequences. As for my dad, I haven't heard from him since that day in the coffee shop. Maybe he's realized that I'm not going to be the safety net they thought I was, or maybe he's too embarrassed to reach out. Either way, I'm at peace with it. I've learned that sometimes you have to walk away from the people who are supposed to be family. If they're only causing you pain, it sucks, but it's necessary. At the end of the day, I know I made the right choice for me.